So I'm now at the third part of this lecture about problem texts. And as you can see, this is about structures lessons. What I mean by that is that when we come to a difficult story, one of the ways of getting at what's happening in a story is like, you might think, so the story with Norman Bowker going around the lake, it's like, what's that about? Is it a war story or is it a story about the town? And why does it have that ending? I mean, what? So he steps in the lake. It's like, what is he going to commit suicide or what's going on? No, he's not. But what's going on? What are we supposed to take away? There are these two different narratives. How are they related? Uh, you know. So what might we do? So what we might do is look at how is it organized, very simply. So when we come to difficult stories, and many of them are, in fact, the more you look at stories, the more problematic or difficult they become. Not always. I mean, many stories are designed to be open and shut. I mean, you're supposed to get this, bam. And I'm sure you can think of them. There's not a lot of subtlety there. It's like clong. If you miss the point in something like we just saw Watchmen, the series, if you somehow miss the point in Watchmen, it's like, really? I mean, what did you miss? Like, did you miss that, say, slavery is bad and that we treat African Americans badly and that the law is against people who have been othered and oppressed? And it's like, that we are supposed to be the authors of our own destiny and we are not. And okay, you can get the surface level meanings. You should be able to get the surface level meanings with some of these texts right off the bat, right? But then there's more complexity. Okay. But what happens is the more you read, the more you read, right? And the more you read, the more problematic things become. And this is why people hate going to movies with folks from MIT, because folks from MIT come out and say, "I wonder if this meant this," and people are like, "Could we just see a movie? Couldn't we just enjoy it?" It's like, yeah, we are enjoying it. We're also interpreting it. Duh. Okay, so I don't mean when I talk about structure that the job is for you to create what an English teacher would have called, say, a plot map, which is like, then this happens, and then there's a rising action, and then, then there's a confusion, and then the hero, a plot map. Forget that. Blech. But is the structure linear? Is it circular? What does it look like? Does it start at A and pretty much go through M to Z? I mean, is it straightforward? Or is it broken? What are we told first and why? We often think that what in this culture, first is best and last is usually either the most important or the least important. But often, which is why people often say, last but not least, because it's often true that the thing that comes last is the most unimportant thing. So what about that? Is it a distributed narrative? That is, it's a narrative that's been broken up into a bunch of different pieces and sort of thrown around. And so you have to go, to different people, let's say, because each person has a different piece of the narrative and you must go to them for their little story. And this is the way a lot of procedurals are, mystery stories where, the cops or the private eye or whoever it is doing the solving of the mystery has to run off to, they have to talk to this person. And then there's a little tiny piece of evidence that it turns out somebody's been holding on to, a line, a connection between this and that. And you're like, and it's often, that piece often shows up at about 5/6 of the way through a mystery narrative. And you're like, oh, we didn't know this all along. And then, the light comes on, basically. So that's a distributed narrative. Agatha Christie stories are often that, but really contemporary murder mysteries look like that very often, where everybody has a little piece of the narrative. Nobody has the complete knowledge. The detective is going for complete knowledge, right? And when we read a text, are the detective. We are after complete knowledge. Now, presumably the person who has complete knowledge is the author. That's what we used to think. We used to think the author knew exactly everything that was happening inside the text. The author was God, effectively. That's very much a 19th century understanding of how the author works. If we pay attention to the way time works in the narrative, which is what I'm suggesting here, and often is useful for war narratives, because war stories are usually stories of trauma. I mean, that's probably why we read them. And trauma is often broken. it breaks the narrative because we come back to a story in broken pieces. It returns to us, and we don't really know how to tell it and how to get through it, and so on. So O'Brien is thinking about this when he writes his narrative of his own narrative, and this is a very standard. It's called a piece of metafiction, basically. And on page 152, he's talking about him talking, right? So he's talking, and then he's talking about him talking. He says, when I received, so here he is, Tim O'Brien, the author, talking about Tim O'Brien, the narrator, receiving the letter from Norman Bowker. And then there's the story inside that, which is Speaking of Courage, right? In which Tim O'Brien is a character. Right? So there are a series of concentric rings here. And we're dealing with the narrator still. Now, you may think, oh, I'm dealing with Tim O'Brien, the actual author. It's like, no, you're dealing with Tim O'Brien, a construct. You have no idea whether or not speaking in the notes about Speaking in Courage are being told to you straight up or whether he's lying. We don't know. Okay, he says, yet when I received Norman Bowker's letter, it occurred to me that the act of writing had led me through a swirl of memories. This word, swirl, is going to be really important. That might otherwise have ended in paralysis or worse. By telling stories, you objectify your own experience. You separate it from yourself. You pin down certain truths. You make up others. You start sometimes with an incident that truly happened, like the night in the shitfield on 152. So let's go back through this, right? So there's the swirl of memories, which is, and he says you ended in paralysis or worse. Okay, so what happens if you say have a story and you can't get it out? You can't narrate it. It's too horrible. It's too horrible to tell. It's too horrible to think about. Then you may be paralyzed by the story. And you may not be, people say, you have to move on. It's like, well, you may not be able to move on until you actually can metabolize the story, somehow get it out, get it, basically represent it to yourself, maybe in therapy, like who knows? Or worse. Yeah, I mean, it may be impossible for you to get your head straight, to use an old phrase, until you find a way to narrate this story. By telling stories, you objectify your own experience. So if you tell a story, you're beginning to put outside you, objectify, make an object out of something that's happened to you, but now is internal. It's only inside here, right? You separate it from yourself. So as I begin to tell a story, I create a thing, this object out here, and the object out here begins to assume its own reality, separate from me, especially if I write it down or I make a film of it or I make a painting of it. I represent it in some way, right? You separate it from yourself. You pin down certain truths. So some things I'm going to be able to get in this writing or a piece of art or whatever it is, narrative, film I make, whatever. But he says, but you make up others. You're not going to tell the truth the whole time because it's probably going to be too painful. And do you want everybody to see that? I mean, do you really want to, show everybody everything you've got? It's a dangerous thing to do, right? You start sometimes with an incident that truly happened. And then what happens, right? So if we look at these two stories that we're dealing with, that I've asked you to look at, we can see that we think one is linear, and it isn't. And the other one, well, it looks like a circle. And not just one circle either, but two circles, right? And he talks about this on page 152, because this is why O'Brien is so useful. He says, using the lake as a nucleus around which the story would orbit. Okay, so let me make myself a little smaller here. Yeah, get your big head out of the way there, Tim. All right, so I know this looks like a lot, but it's okay. Just take a minute and we'll look at it together. So what we're looking at is the internal chronological events of what happens as we read the story. So I sort of went through here and I kind of divided the story up in the smallest units that I could without going crazy, because some things are just like a sentence long. So the first thing that happens as you read How to Tell a True War Story is that Kylie Rat Kiley is writing a letter to Kurt Lemon's sister, and then the narrator comes in, right, and with his this is how to tell a true war story, and then we're back to Kurt Lemon's death. The narrator comes on and talks about happening truth. Then Mitchell Saunders tells the story about the listening post. Then the narrator's back and says, "What's Mitchell Saunders doing in here?" And Saunders then says, "Oh, here's what I'm doing in here. Here's my moral. The narrator comes back. Generalizations don't work in war, which itself is, of course, a generalization. And then Rat Kiley tells the story about the baby buffalo. And so, as you can see, like, this is the actual, if we went through it and we just said, like, what is the next thing that happens in this story? This is the listing we would get. That's all always very useful to develop this kind of thing. As I say, it's not really a plot map, it's a listing of, like, what happens in, what are the events that happen in this narrative? And when we look at them, we can see, oh, okay, there's a pattern here. The narrator keeps appearing and telling us things. And then there are little illustrations. Or are they illustrations? Are they working against, do they work with the narrator, against the narrator? How does this stuff work for us? How is there a relationship between the stories and what the narrator is telling? Or are they fighting, or what? Now, remember that overall, one author is in control of this whole thing. So the narrator, there's one person controlling the narrator, one person controlling Rat Kiley, Kurt Lemon, Mitchell Saunders, and so on. But we begin to think, well, here's this character who has their own teleology. They have their own existence. They have their own means and ends. Basically, they have their own designs on the world. Right? So, what about that? Okay, and then, so now this is going to get it. So this is the first way to go at it. But then how about if we look at the two different ways I talked about when we, a couple of a unit ago, where there is the order in which we read the things, which I've labeled 1 to 15. But then there's the order in which they actually occur. So what if we go back into the narrative? Stay with me here. I know it's like, so actually what's the first thing that happens? And the first thing that happens is that Rat Kiley's letter to Kurt Lemon's sister is the first thing that happens. And then there's a post-war interjection from the narrator. And then Kurt Lemon's death happens, and then the narrator comes in. And then is it 5 that comes next? We don't know exactly, when Mitchell Saunders tells the story about the listing post and so on. So the first thing is the order in which we read them, and then there's the order in which they occur. All right. So we can reorganize this list then by looking at how do things actually chronologically occur if we took all the pieces apart and we said, all right, let's get this story down. What's the first thing that happens? Kurt Lemon dies. Okay. And then somebody's singing the Lemon Tree song. Lemon Tree, very pretty. Because Kurt Lemon is hanging in the tree, right? His body's hanging in the tree. Then there's the narrator talking about sunlight. Then there's the story of Rat Kiley and the baby buffalo, and Mitchell Saunders' story about the listing post. Saunders tells the story about the narrator of the moral. Then Rat Kiley's letter to Kurt Lemon's sister. And then after that, because that's all the war, right? That's all that happens. That all happens in the late 60s. Then the narrator comes along in the 90s when the story is being written and says, this is how to tell a true war story. This is what happening truth is. Here's about Saunders, and basically has a series of reflections about what it was like some 25 years ago when he was involved in this event. So everything that happens chronologically first happened 25 years ago. And then, well, this because the book is written in 1990, or was published in 1990, 1991. So basically, so that things are, the present is 1990, 1991, but the past is 1968, 1969. So the first things that happened in the Vietnam War, and they happen in the order of the cause is Kurt Lemon's death. That's what brings about the telling of a true war story. So the internal narrative structure, the temporal structure of the story can be very helpful to us when we look at this. So we can then mix these two things together. Right? You saw this was coming, right? And this is what it looks like. So I've stayed with the internal, or pardon me, the external chronological order, which is the, first Kurt Lemmons' death. So that how did things occur temporally? First Kurt Lemmon dies, then all the things happen, then the narrator comes along. But the order in which they occur, according to us, is that 7 happens first, and then 1, and then 5 and 6, and so on. And the narrator comes in post-war with these, so it would be post-war would be 8, so it'd be like 7, 8, 1, 9, 5, 10, and so on. So this is, as you can see, one of the ways of beginning to take apart what looks like a very complex narrative. In fact, it's just 2 narratives, right? The narrator's narrative, which I know sounds complex, but the narrator's own story about telling the story, and the story of Kurt Lemmons' death. And when we put these 2 together and we weave them together, we have what can really break your head apart. It's like, I don't know how to get this apart. It's like, okay, well, that's exactly what we're going to do. We're going to pull them into 2 pieces. So what if at that moment you disturb the integrity of the story? It's like, so you'll put it back together. Don't worry about that. So this is what is fairly obviously a nonlinear structure. All right. So what if we have an even more nonlinear structure? So like there's the Kurt Lemmons story, but then there's super nonlinear stuff, right? So if we look at the story about Norman Bowker, and that's what I'm coming to now, that's going to be even more, not more complex. It's just a different form. However, I am going to pause this here.